Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 3. The chapter begins with Nebuchadnezzar setting up an image of himself that is a little unusual in its proportion of height and width, and we'll be looking at why that might be. We'll look at the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are faithful to Yahweh despite the fact that they are required to bow down to that image. They refuse to do so and are thrown into the fiery furnace. They survive the furnace in the presence of one like a son of a god. We'll look at what that phrase might mean today as we unpack the treasures of Daniel chapter 3.
Daniel 3 verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made a statue of gold. Its height was 60 cubits, and its width was 6 cubits. He set it up in the valley of Dura in the province of Babylon. And actually this first verse is what is interesting to me, and that's this word statue, or Aramaic there for image, an image of gold. Of course, we just read about a statue or image in the previous chapter. What did that one look like?
Well, the head was gold. It was all different kinds of metals.
Okay, yes, it was made of all kinds of metals. It had a head, it had arms and a torso, it had a waist, and it had legs. So it obviously looked like what? A person. And so most people assume that this golden statue, also looks like a person. It is the word for image, just like the word for the statue in chapter 2 was an image, and is made all of gold, unlike the first statue, which only had the head of gold, and the rest of them were other metals. So many times the thought is that Nebuchadnezzar saw that image, kept that image in his head, but he wanted to be the whole thing, not just the head. So he makes the statue all of gold. There's one challenge to this mental picture of a golden image of a man. Look at the dimensions. It is 60 cubits high, which is huge. Cubits are a relative measure. But what about a feet? If this was 10 feet high, this is a 10-foot high man, how wide is he?
9 feet.
1 foot wide. 10-foot tall man, as tall as this room, 1 foot wide. Right. 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide. I am wider than 1 foot. Sadly, perhaps. But if I were 10 feet high and no wider than I am, that might actually be appropriate proportions. But it would still be oddly elongated. If I were only 1 foot wide and 60 foot tall, could I even stand without falling over in the slightest breeze? No. I'm not sure that what we have here in chapter 3 is in fact a shape of a man. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't depict a man. These are images of stela. I meant to go look that up. I don't know if it's stela, it's S-T-E-L-E. I read it all the time about these ancient inscriptions, but I rarely say it. So I don't know if it's a long E or a soft E or what it is, but stela, maybe it's steel. I really should look that up.
I think the E is silent.
The last E is silent? Stel? It's a stel. Okay. Good. We'll go with that. I'll try not to say it at all for the rest of the speech. But you can see that the first one, which is of an unidentified Babylonian king, and so we don't know what date it was, has an image of a man on it, so it could still be an image, even if it's not the shape of one, the outline of one in profile. But we can see an image of a man on this statue. I'll just use the biblical word. And then the middle one is the Code of Hammurabi statue. Now we can date that one. It's 1750 BC in the Babylonian area. So that one is tall, and it still has an image of Hammurabi at the top of it. And then that last one there is the Shalmaneser obelisk, It's from 827 BC. I had to throw that one in there because it's Assyrian, not Babylonian, but it has Jehu on it, the King Jehu from biblical Israel, giving tribute to Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king. So these are an example of the kind of things they would erect. Assyrians and Babylonians, they put these all over. They are scattered throughout the kingdom. They would put up these obelisks or stal and engrave their great acts, their victories, military victories, and like the Code of Hammurabi has his legal code inscribed on it. There's something important that you need to know about this king. They would put it in stone and then erect it. So what's notable about Nebuchadnezzar's is that he had it apparently overlaid in gold. And then it was extremely tall, which would, if you needed that much space to say all the great things about Nebuchadnezzar, then that even more just talks about his ego and wanting to make this impression. So one last one, though, I wanted to throw in there is this one, this incomplete, just a surviving portion of a stele dedicated to the Babylonian king Nabonidus. Now that's important because Nabonidus actually connects to the story of Daniel. He's not mentioned anywhere in there, but his son is. The son of King Nabonidus, Belshazzar. Now those who've studied Daniel know that we are going to hit Belshazzar in a couple of chapters. So this is a bit of archaeology that ties in to the story that we're reading. But you can see how something like this could be 60 feet high or 60 cubits high and 1 cubit wide. And it would still be a little bit tippy, perhaps, especially in gold, which is so heavy, but it would still be that tall, and it wouldn't be odd-looking, emaciated-looking man. So that's what I think. What it is exactly isn't the key thing. What is the key thing is that what he erected in gold, he expected everyone to worship. That's his next verse, verse 2. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent directions to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all of the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. This chapter is notable in that the grandiosity of this statue, of the dedication of the statue, is overwrought. There's just it's hard to say exaggerated. It's not exaggerated in that way of doing it by like describing it as, well, I mean, it's a huge thing, so it is an exaggerated stele, if that's what it is. But he lists all these things: satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates. It's exaggeration by, or emphasis by just every little nook and cranny, every person. There's a word for it, for you, a figure of speech that just makes its point by adding on and almost redundant. Yes, they are different offices, and yes, they did have different things, but you really don't have to mention every single office when you're saying that they're coming, unless you're trying to make the point that this is comprehensive. It's, I want everybody in the whole kingdom with any authority at all to bow down to this statue. This dedication that it mentions here, one other reason why I think that this stele would be appropriate image, mental picture, rather than a statue as we think of one, is that we know that these were used as loyalty symbols, and that when they would dedicate one of these steles, they would erect it, have the important people of the area come to it. Notice how this was in verse 1, it emphasizes it's in Babylon, in Dura of Babylon. This would have been specifically for that province, for the people of that province and the leaders of that province to come to this one. And then they would, the king whose remarkable works were being inscribed on this stele, he would stand to the side and observe the dedication as if he was sort of uninterested or a separate party. And yet, the people who would be offering to the stele, they would be like making offerings to the memorial itself, were implicitly making memorials to the god of that country. So they would be offering to the god of Nebuchadnezzar. Whoever god Nebuchadnezzar was, they would be offering to that god as Nebuchadnezzar watched on. And they offered to the stele. So that's kind of what we can imagine is going on. He erects this statue of gold. He invites everybody to come to the dedication. And so they are not going to be offering directly to Nebuchadnezzar per se, but they will be offering to his gods and to what the stele stands for, himself, his power. Well, and then we have the herald in verses 4 and 6. The herald proclaimed aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and people of all languages, that the time that you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and you must worship the statue of gold that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown immediately into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire." So this is another example of reiteration or just adding on. First, it's all peoples, nations, and people of all languages. So to go to Alan's point that this was about power and authority and how every office is supposed to be represented, no matter how minuscule their authority. If they were an authority, they were to come here and dedicate themselves to Nebuchadnezzar's authority.
Well, that would be also acknowledging that he was the source of the authority that they did have.
Also true, that's right. Their authority came from him and flows to him. But this is this verse is in saying that all people are under Nebuchadnezzar. So all powers are under Nebuchadnezzar's authority, and all peoples are under Nebuchadnezzar's authority. This is to emphasize they had incorporated other ethnicities, other groups into Babylon, just as when they had conquered Judah, they took Judah into Babylonian captivity. And this was an emphasis that now they owe their allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar, first and foremost. And then the musical thing, another tidbit that is just overdone. Flute, lyre, horn, trigon, the harp, the drum, and all kinds of music. Do you really have to list every instrument in the orchestra? When you say, listen to when the music plays, bow down, but they list everything in the orchestra. Again, just to emphasize and make it even more grandiose and impressive.
Well, there's always a loophole. If I don't hear the cowbell, I don't have to kneel.
That's right. I didn't hear the lyre, so I don't have to. But yeah, that's maybe a good point, that they're closing all the loopholes, not only with the list of people who are supposed to be there, but also with what triggers your bowing down. Anything. You hear any kind of music, you bow down to this statue. Or you go into the blazing fire. That's the other side of things. Verse 8. Therefore, at this time, some astrologers came forward and they denounced the Jews. Now, if it weren't for this verse, we might not even think of a Jewish per se connection. They didn't bow down. We know that. This is no spoiler alert. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't bow down, and they could have just been thrown in for that. But this implies that there's a anti-Semitic element to this. And the word therefore at the beginning of the verse implies a kind of causal relationship. It's not stated, it's a little bit implied here, but it's like when Daniel is set up with the rule about praying and how you're not supposed to pray to anybody else. That's coming later in the book of Daniel, but this is sort of like that. There's the hint that this whole statue being set up and requiring everybody to bow down to the statue, that might have been the instigation of these guys who were specifically trying to trap Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into something that they knew they wouldn't do. So these astrologers, these are the same guys who failed to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was and what it meant in the last chapter. But they come forward and denounce the Jews. What is the ultimate irony of the astrologers doing that? Exactly. If Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and of course their friend Daniel, hadn't come forward and given Nebuchadnezzar the answer, these guys would be dead. Well, this is what they say to Nebuchadnezzar. I'm going to read verse 9 and skip down to verse 12. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, may you live forever. There are Judean men whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay you no heed, and were not serving your God and the statue of gold that you set up. They are not worshiping." So they make sure Nebuchadnezzar is aware of what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are doing. Now, see, they're not telling anybody else not to do it. They're just standing by, and they're holding their ground. They're not causing anybody else problems or doing anything. They're just standing alone. But these astrologers want to point out that they're not doing what Nebuchadnezzar told them. All right, and then skipping down to verses 13 and then 15. And then Nebuchadnezzar said in rage and anger to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought in these men before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Now, if you're ready, so that when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, and the drum, and all kinds of music, you fall down and you worship the statue that I have made, that will be good. But if you do not worship it, immediately you will be thrown into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who will rescue you from my hands?" Oh, to his credit, Nebuchadnezzar does something he probably wouldn't have done for practically anybody else. He gives them a second chance. The herald said, if you don't do it, you'll be immediately thrown into the furnace of fire. Well, they're not. They're brought to Nebuchadnezzar, and he gives them benefit of the doubt or whatever, and he says, look, if you're ready to now, I will let you off the hook, but you are going to go into the furnace of fire if you don't do it now. And probably that last bit is the kicker for him. What God, who is the God who's going to rescue you from my hands? He should know who that God is, because that God gave him the answer to his dream in the previous chapter. Daniel made a point of saying, I can't tell you the meaning of your dream, but there's a God in heaven who can, and he says this to you. And here's what he said to you in the dream, and here's what it means. So Daniel has already emphasized that, and Nebuchadnezzar has already said, blessed be the God of Daniel. He's acknowledged that God exists. But here, and this may have been years later, the Septuagint copy of this story actually says it's like 15 years later. There is some time elapsed, and in that time, whatever time it is, Nebuchadnezzar's ego has overshadowed his knowledge of this God of Daniel. And we can get that way. We can get into our own routines and in our own heads and forget what we used to know and act in ways that are irresponsible, as he is doing here. In Daniel 3:16-18, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need on this matter to present a defense to you. If it is so, our God whom we serve is able to rescue us from the furnace of the blazing fire. And from your hand, O king, let him rescue us. And if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods and the statue of gold that you have set up. We will not worship. So it's a little bit of a shame. The Aramaic here is difficult and a little bit odd. But this is the money quote for the whole chapter. It doesn't matter whether God rescues us or not. He can. He could certainly rescue us from that furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your gods. We'd rather die than worship your gods. And I love the opening. We have no need on this matter to present a defense to you. The implication in the original language is that we don't have to give it a second thought. We're not going to be cagey. We're not going to try to be clever. We're not going to beg for our lives. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to tell you simply, God can rescue us. If he doesn't, fine. We're not worshiping your gods. Bottom line. That's a scary thing to do. So let's give them props, these three, for standing up that way. This is what Christians faced in Rome, too. They were facing not fire, but the lions in the days of Rome. And Christians in countries today face this same challenge. Denounce Jesus and we won't shoot you. Denounce Jesus and we won't cut off your head. Denounce Jesus and we won't burn you alive. But Christians today still stand up and say, no, I will not turn my back on God. I would rather die than serve your God or deny Christ. Daniel 3:19 and 20. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with anger, and the image of his face was changed. This is the image of his face. It's the same word it's been using of the statue this whole time. It's interesting, and this is the last time that image is mentioned in the chapter, is that its own face. It's like some connection between him and the statue, and his face changed and turned against Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. So he ordered and said to heat up the one furnace 7 times what it was usual to heat it up. And he commanded the strongest men of the guards who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So they get the furnace as hot as they possibly can to throw in the 3. But we read in verses 21 through 23, then these men were bound with their garments, their trousers, and their turbans, and their other clothing, and they were thrown into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, because the word of the king was severe, and the furnace was exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed these men who lifted up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these men, the 3 of them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, and they were bound. Now, we don't yet know what's going to happen to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're in the flames. But what we do know is that Nebuchadnezzar has killed his own men. If the furnace had been at its normal temperature, they would have been hot, but they would have just thrown the men in and walked away. But because of Nebuchadnezzar's temper, and temper tantrum of a sense, he killed his own 3 strongest men. The best of his army he killed out of envy, jealousy, rage. Out of his anger, he kills his own men in this process. Isn't that so realistic? We hurt ourselves when we get angry, when we go off in a rage. The only people we hurt are ourselves. Not the only. We can actually hurt other people too, but we definitely hurt ourselves when we do that. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar hurt his 3 best guys. Daniel 3:24-25. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and he rose up in haste, and he asked, saying to the advisors, did we not throw 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered, saying to the king, certainly, O king. And he answered, saying, look, I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and there's no damage to them, and the appearance of the 4th man resembles the son of a god. And so there's that angelic figure in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it emphasized earlier, you noticed, what they were wearing. They had turbans, robes. They were dressed to the nines. Obviously, they had been at this official event where they were supposed to be representing the Jews. And that's one of the things, that these 3 men at this event were representing the Jews as a people, because that's what the whole event was about. These representatives of the nations that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered were coming to show loyalty to him. So they represented their people, and they weren't going to bow down. And now they're thrown into the fire, and the only thing that gets burned up are the ropes binding them. Their turbans, their clothing, their shoes, nothing else is touched by the fire. Now the 4th man, there's one interpretation that this is the pre-incarnate Christ, like the angel of God in appearance. There's not quite enough detail here to be certain with that identification. Any messenger of God is powerful enough to walk around in a furnace without getting burned. I think Gabriel could probably pull it off, or Michael. And certainly Jesus, of course, as the angel of God. But in whatever divine being is in that furnace, is protecting them and with them, comforting them. And and it astonishes Nebuchadnezzar. So verses 26 and 27. Nebuchadnezzar approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire, called out, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out here and come here. So then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the middle of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the advisors of the king were assembling, and they saw these men, that the fire had no power over their bodies, and the hair of their heads was not singed, and their garments were not harmed, and the smell of fire did not come from them. So yes, completely untouched by anything in that furnace. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar responded, saying, Blessed be their God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued the servants who trusted in him, and the command of the king they disobeyed, and they gave their bodies so that they did not serve and did not worship any god except their God. It's, again, an extraordinary response. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't always act right, but when he's beaten, he admits it. And he admits that this God is greater than his God and greater than him. And so he admits they disobeyed the king, but they were right in doing so. It's what he's admitting here. And that's just extraordinary for Nebuchadnezzar. And then verses 29 and 30, and from me is set forth the decree that any people, nation, or language that may utter criticism against their God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, will be broken into pieces, and their house will be made like ruins. Now, where have we heard that phrase before? That's the exact phrase about what happened to the statue in the dream, and what Nebuchadnezzar said would be to those who couldn't interpret it. They would be broken to pieces and made like ruins.
Off with their heads.
Right. For there is not another God who is able to rescue like this God. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So if they were trying to discredit these three Jews, those astrologers, their plan backfired. They were already in high regard in Babylon, and now they were just even more so. So their plan backfired, God's plan succeeded, and the people that were faithful to God emerged from the fire unharmed.
Thank you for studying Daniel with me today. I hope that you'll add some comments or questions to the YouTube channel below this video, or hop over to Facebook and look for the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group where we can dialogue about Daniel there. Or you can always email me at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net. Thanks, and I'll see you again as we unpack the treasures that are in the storeroom of Scripture.